Sirens tear across the evening skyline as a tower-sized shockwave rips through a downtown mall, glass and concrete folding like paper, and people spilling into the street with the gravity of sudden, terrible consequences. Superman arrives first, a blue blur cutting through dust, hands already cradling twisted steel, and prying open a collapsed stairwell while officers shout coordinates into static. But the readings in his HUD refuse to resolve what his eyes insist is impossible. At the heart of the ruin, a single, unremarkable man stands barefoot on a pile of rubble, his yellow jumpsuit smudged with dust, and his expression bored in a way that looks obscene beneath falling debris. When Superman reaches him, scans fail to align, no alien signature, no tech residue, no radiation spike, only the ordinary rhythm of a human pulse, and the absurd fact that no one he must save is hurt because that man refuses to let them be. This is not an accident. It is a beginning, and whatever rulebook governed the world just slipped a page. Subscribe now. I'll track every ripple and consequence as Superman tries to classify what he can't, and those consequences won't stay small. If you care about understanding how a world-ending mismatch unfolds, this is the channel to follow closely. By the time Superman returns to the epicenter of the collapse, emergency crews have already formed a perimeter that no longer makes sense, because the interior damage pattern refuses to behave like any structural failure he has ever cataloged. Entire load-bearing beams have sheared without torsion stress, support columns have snapped as if compressed from every direction at once, and yet the civilians who should have been caught between cascading floors are standing outside with nothing worse than dust in their lungs. In the middle of that contradiction stands Saitama, hands in his pockets, looking down at a cracked tile like he's trying to remember why he walked into a supermarket in the first place. Superman floats down carefully, aware that the situation is no longer strictly about rescue, because every scan he runs returns a baseline human physiology that should not survive what the building clearly experienced. Saitama glances up and offers a polite nod that reads less like acknowledgement and more like a commuter noticing someone else on the train. And when Superman thanks him for assisting with evacuations, the man answers with a simple, no problem that carries no pride or expectation. Superman's X-ray vision passes through muscle and bone, an organ without interruption, mapping a completely normal anatomy that contradicts the impact crater behind him. And when he narrows the focus to look for microfractures or thermal scarring, he finds nothing to explain how this person had apparently intercepted a kinetic event that would have killed dozens. A helicopter camera swings low enough to catch them both in the same frame, and the rotor wash kicks up dust that settles across Saitama's cape without him reacting at all. The first escalation happens when a secondary collapse begins without warning, the adjacent parking structure dropping a full story as its supports give way under delayed stress, and Superman moves to catch the fall while calling out for everyone to clear the perimeter. Saitama doesn't move immediately, which forces Superman to adjust his grip and distribute the load across a wider section of the facade. But then the man steps forward and places one hand against a slab of concrete as casually as if he's steadying a closing door. The motion halts, not gradually but completely, and for a moment Superman assumes the structure has jammed against a remaining support, until he feels the load redistribute in a way that implies the entire mass is being resisted from a single point. Superman shifts his hold and lets the slab settle under Saitama's hand to confirm the read, expecting micro-tremors or compensatory movement from the man's shoulder or spine. But there is none. The heartbeat he hears remains steady, unaccelerated, and when he sweeps heat vision across the contact point to cauterize a sparking cable, the reflected thermal signature from Saitama's glove shows no spike in temperature where friction should be converting force to heat. It is the first time in a long while that Superman feels uncertainty in the middle of a save, and it forces him to slow down in a way that would be unacceptable under any other circumstance. A named witness complicates things further when Lois Lane arrives with a press badge and a camera crew, already speaking into a live feed about an unidentified responder who reached trapped shoppers before first responders could secure the stairwells. She calls Saitama a civilian volunteer, which seems to please him more than it should, and when she asks Superman whether he's coordinating with local hero registries, he answers that they are still assessing the situation. The truth is that no registry he knows of would produce someone who can pin a falling parking deck with one hand, while looking bored enough to be waiting for a bus. Cause becomes effect when the city's monitoring grid flags the seismic signature of the collapse as inconsistent with gravity-only failure, and the alert routes to Star Labs, where technicians begin correlating footage of the initial impact with Superman's arrival time. They notice that the shockwave stops expanding at the exact moment Saitama steps into frame, which leads them to request permission for a non-invasive scan of the volunteer who appears to have acted as a kinetic sink. Superman agrees in principle, because the alternative is to pretend that a normal human stopped a structural cascade with no measurable exertion. Saitama doesn't object when asked to step into an ambulance for a routine check, mostly because someone mentioned snacks, and that lack of resistance makes the next part easier even as it makes the situation more uncomfortable. Superman stands just outside the open doors while a medic applies a sensor pad to Saitama's wrist, expecting to see the first hint of strain or latent injury that would reconcile the footage with reality. Instead, the readouts confirm a resting pulse and a body temperature that matches ambient conditions within a degree. The irreversible escalation arrives quietly when Superman runs one last scan before the ambulance doors close and realizes that the data is not merely normal but inconsistent across wavelengths, as though the biological density of Saitama's tissues refuses to present the same profile twice in a row. He tries again, narrowing the band, and the inconsistency persists without pattern, which means he cannot even categorize the anomaly as interference. The ambulance pulls away with Saitama asking if he can keep the blanket, and Superman watches it go while understanding that a routine assist has become an investigation. Star Labs does not treat the request as urgent at first, because the city experiences structural failures often enough that a helpful bystander rarely becomes a priority beyond a basic health check and a thank you from the mayor's office. That assumption changes the moment Superman arrives unannounced and asks for direct access to the ambulance bay where the volunteer is being evaluated, and the staff recognize the tone he uses when something refuses to fit into the existing framework. Saitama is sitting upright on a gurney with a paper cup of juice and a packet of crackers, answering questions about allergies with the same flat calm he uses to confirm that he walked to the mall because it was on sale day. Dr. Emil Hamilton takes the lead once the initial vitals come back, and he approaches the situation with a professional neutrality that quickly erodes under repetition, because every instrument he places on Saitama returns a baseline human metric that should not coexist with the footage they have already reviewed. Superman stands beside the console and runs passive scans in parallel, comparing what he hears and sees with what the machines insist upon, and he finds that Saitama's heartbeat remains steady even when Hamilton increases the cuff pressure to a level that would normally cause discomfort. When asked whether the strap is too tight, Saitama replies that it's fine, and then asks if there are more crackers. Hamilton escalates the test in a way that remains non-invasive by introducing a calibrated pressure plate beneath Saitama's bare foot, explaining that it's a simple balance assessment used for athletes returning from injury. The plate is designed to register micro-adjustments in posture under changing loads, and when Superman applies a controlled downward force to Saitama's shoulder at Hamilton's request, the readout should spike to reflect compensatory muscle activation. Instead, the graph flattens, the numbers hovering in a range consistent with someone standing in a grocery line, and the absence of reaction forces Hamilton to recalibrate twice before he looks up at Superman for confirmation. Superman reduces the applied force to avoid causing harm, and then increases it incrementally, remaining within the limits of what a human frame could reasonably endure. But the plate continues to display a load distribution that implies nothing is being resisted at all. The heartbeat he hears does not accelerate, and when he shifts to heat vision at the lowest possible output to observe surface response, the thermal camera shows no localized warming where friction should exist between skin and polymer. Hamilton asks for permission to run an ultrasound, not to probe deeper, but to verify that there isn't a gel layer or embedded material that could be dispersing force, and Saitama shrugs in agreement. The ultrasound wand glides across Saitama's forearm, producing a cross-section that looks so normal it becomes suspicious by contrast, because the density should vary under prior stress if the footage is accurate. Hamilton freezes the image and increases the resolution, expecting to see microtears or edema that would justify the collapse halting under a human hand, but the muscle fibers appear unremarkable, the connective tissue intact. Superman hears the machine's hum and the steady beat beneath it, and for the first time since arriving, he asks Saitama a direct question about how he managed to stop the parking structure. Saitama answers without hesitation that he pushed it back up, adding that it was going to fall on people, and the simplicity of the explanation creates a gap that none of the instruments can fill. Lois Lane appears at the observation window, having secured permission to document the process under the condition that no proprietary methods are shown, and she watches as Hamilton introduces a new variable in the form of a handheld impact tester. The device delivers a controlled tap used to measure reflexive contraction, and when it contacts Saitama's patellar tendon, the expected response fails to materialize even though the baseline neurological scan remains normal. Cause becomes effect when Hamilton logs the absence of reflex and requests a follow-up using a vibration stimulus, because if the nervous system is intact, there should be some observable reaction to oscillation at the applied frequency. Superman places 2 fingers lightly against Saitama's wrist to monitor any change in pulse while the device hums, and he finds nothing to suggest that the body recognizes a challenge or a need to respond. Saitama looks mildly annoyed only when asked to sit still for longer than a minute, and that annoyance does not translate into any measurable change. The irreversible escalation arrives when Superman, after explaining the need for verification, applies a brief but focused burst of heat vision to a metal rod that Hamilton positions near Saitama's hand, intending to test conductive transfer through contact. The rod glows to a temperature that would normally force an immediate withdrawal, but when Saitama touches it to steady the stand, the thermal camera shows the heat dissipating without leaving any trace on skin or air. Hamilton steps back, understanding that the problem is no longer about injury tolerance, but about the absence of any detectable limit. Outside the bay, alarms begin to register from the city's monitoring grid as a second, unrelated structure reports stress fractures along its supports, and the pattern mirrors the earlier collapse with unsettling precision. Superman looks from the readouts to Saitama, who asks if the tests are almost done, and realizes that verification has not reduced uncertainty. It has created a new category he cannot name. The next event is already underway across town. The second structural alert does not trigger panic at first, because the city's infrastructure grid is designed to absorb anomalies in isolation. But the moment Star Labs overlays the new stress fractures with the earlier collapse, the correlation becomes statistically significant in a way that forces the response out of municipal hands. WayneTech's Urban Resilience Division receives the mirrored data through an interagency channel, and Lucius Fox authorizes a live diagnostic sweep of nearby transit tunnels to determine whether the stress is environmental or kinetic. Superman leaves the lab with Saitama walking beside him at an unhurried pace, both of them following a route mapped by emergency dispatch toward a parking garage that is beginning to settle without an identifiable load shift. The corporate response manifests as drones before it manifests as policy, because WayneTech's mobile survey units arrive on site to triangulate vibrational patterns that could precede a full collapse, and their LiDAR arrays map the structure down to millimeter variants. Saitama looks up at the hovering machines with mild curiosity and asks if they're filming a movie, while Superman listens to the subsonic tremor beneath the concrete and hears the same non-pattern he registered earlier. The garage is not failing along a seam or joint. It is compressing in a way that implies a force has already passed through it and left nothing measurable behind. Lucius Fox joins via secure link and requests permission to integrate Superman's passive scans with the drone's telemetry, because if the phenomenon is dispersing force without leaving heat or fracture signatures, they will need a live comparator. Superman agrees, aware that the investigation has shifted from rescue to classification, and he positions himself near the structure's primary support while instructing Saitama to remain clear of any falling debris. Saitama nods, then steps forward anyway when a pedestrian stumbles near a cracked pillar, steadying both the person and the concrete with the same absent-minded efficiency he used earlier. Cause becomes effect when the drones register a sudden flattening of stress lines across the pillar Saitama touches, not a reduction, but a cancellation that propagates outward in a ripple too uniform to be random. Fox asks whether Superman applied counterforce, and the answer is no, because he has not yet moved, which forces the system to flag Saitama as an active variable despite every biological scan denying that possibility. The corporate legal team, monitoring in parallel, begins drafting language that would permit a voluntary materials analysis under emergency cooperation statutes. A named canon voice enters the scene when Batman connects to the same feed from Gotham, having been alerted by WayneTech's anomaly tracker that an unregistered individual is repeatedly intersecting with infrastructure failures and halting them without measurable exertion. He does not issue commands, but he asks for a controlled demonstration if the situation permits, because pattern recognition is the only path forward when instruments refuse to converge. Superman relays the request with care, framing it as a way to prevent future collapses, and Saitama responds by asking whether this will take long. The demonstration is designed to remain within safe limits, using a suspended test mass from a crane that can be released in stages, while Superman monitors the load and WayneTech's drones capture distribution data. When the first increment drops, Superman intercepts it before impact to avoid damaging the deck, and then allows Saitama to place a hand against the underside, while he gradually increases the effective weight through controlled descent. The readouts should show compensatory strain in joints or connective tissue, but instead the mass stabilizes as though it has encountered a boundary that does not translate into pressure. Irreversible escalation arrives when the drones attempt to map the force transfer through Saitama's arm and fail to trace a path from contact point to ground, because the stress disappears between frames rather than traveling through bone or muscle. Batman requests a thermal sweep to detect microheating along the limb, and Superman complies at minimal output, but the camera shows ambient readings throughout. The legal language becomes a formal request for tissue sampling, and Superman knows before he asks that Saitama will not understand why it matters. Saitama declines the sample politely, explaining that he doesn't like needles, and that simple preference closes the only door corporate protocol has opened. Outside the garage, traffic continues to move around barricades, unaware that a framework designed to measure every load-bearing truth in the city has just admitted an exception it cannot encode. The grid flags a third location across the river with the same compressive signature, and the response shifts from study to containment as sirens begin to turn in that direction. By the time the third alert reaches dispatch, the pattern is no longer treated as a coincidence, because the compressive signature now spans 2 boroughs and a transit bridge whose maintenance logs show no pending vulnerabilities. Emergency management reroutes buses away from the span, while police establish a rolling perimeter that grows faster than their available units. And Superman arrives to find a line of commuters stalled between concrete barriers that were not meant to hold against anything except traffic. Saitama follows at street level with the same steady pace he used leaving Star Labs, stopping once to help a cyclist lift a bent wheel away from a guardrail before continuing without comment. The bridge is not cracking in the way bridges usually crack, because the stress lines do not radiate from an impact point, but instead appear along sections that were not under load moments earlier, creating a visual of compression that travels like a shadow across reinforced steel. Superman places a hand against a support truss and listens, hearing no groan of metal fatigue, only the absence of strain where strain should be accumulating, as though the structure is being convinced to forget its own weight. Saitama steps beneath a sagging beam to guide a family toward the far end, and when the beam settles further, he lifts it just enough to allow them to pass without breaking stride. A named reaction reframes the event when Commissioner Gordon connects to the emergency channel to coordinate traffic shutdowns, and he asks whether this is a metahuman incident requiring federal support. Superman answers that they are still assessing, even as WayneTech's drones report the same stress cancellation ripple from Saitama's contact point that they observed at the garage. Gordon orders a full evacuation of the bridge, and the city's alert system begins to ping phones with instructions that no one fully understands. Cause becomes effect when a maintenance vehicle attempts to reverse out of the danger zone, and the pavement beneath its rear tires depresses without cracking, creating a shallow bowl that deepens as if the material is being pressed from below. Superman moves to stabilize the section, but the depression halts when Saitama places his foot on the edge to help the driver turn the wheel, and the LiDAR map updates to show a uniform distribution where none existed seconds earlier. The drones attempt to capture the transfer again and fail, their models unable to trace a vector through which force could have been negated. Batman's voice returns to the channel with a request for synchronized observation, because if the phenomenon is expanding across the city, they need to determine whether Saitama's presence is mitigating or coinciding with the effect. Superman agrees to a controlled separation, asking Saitama to remain at the bridge while he responds to a simultaneous alert at a riverside parking structure, and Saitama nods in a way that suggests the distinction does not matter to him. As Superman departs, the beam Saitama had lifted remains steady long enough for the last civilians to clear. The irreversible escalation arrives at the riverside when Superman finds an entire row of support columns compressing in sequence without any external load, the concrete dimpling inward like soft clay despite intact rebar. He braces the nearest column and applies counterforce, expecting to slow the progression, but the deformation continues along the line as though his effort has not registered. Back on the bridge, WayneTech's feed shows a new ripple emanating from Saitama's position as he steadies a barrier for a fleeing pedestrian, and the bridge's stress map flattens in response. The city's monitoring grid flags additional sites within minutes, each displaying the same non-pattern, and emergency management begins to speak in terms of zones rather than incidents. Lois Lane's live report captures the emptying bridge and the drones circling above Saitama, and she notes that the civilian volunteer appears to be wherever the pressure stops, even when no one can explain why. Superman returns to the span and realizes that the problem is no longer where to apply strength, but how to understand a cancellation that follows a man who hears a normal heartbeat. Sirens multiply across districts as the next alert arrives from a hospital parking deck, and the route there is already being cleared. The nature of the conflict has shifted from isolated failures to a city that is beginning to forget how to hold itself up. Word of a pattern that defies engineering and biology reaches the Pentagon through a chain of reports that move faster than public alerts. Because when a major city's infrastructure starts behaving like tissue instead of machine, The Defense Department privileges certainty over patience. General Samuel Lane convenes a secure video brief with representatives from NORAD, the Army Corps of Engineers, and a small contingent rooted from Argus, and the language in the room sharpens into operational phrases within minutes. Containment, neutralize, capture. Superman is invited to the brief as a courtesy and a necessity, because his presence at multiple scenes and his access to live feeds make him the most reliable human sensor they have, while Lucius Fox provides raw telemetry to whoever requests it, and Batman remains off the record with observational data that only a detective could produce. Lane's reaction is visceral in the way generals' reactions are when confronted with something that cannot be filed into doctrine, because they are trained to fit anomalies into boxes and then act on them. And failing to categorize an object of interest is the last thing a military planner wants. He asks for rules of engagement that assume the phenomenon will resist conventional force, and when Superman explains that their scans keep returning an ordinary human trace, no instrument can consistently describe, Lane translates that ambiguity into a threat matrix and orders a layered response. The first layer is reconnaissance, with drones and satellites tasked to paint the pattern's propagation in millisecond increments, and the second layer is kinetic containment, specialized teams equipped with hardened exosuits and non-explosive tether systems meant to pin a moving mass without creating shrapnel. Saitama, predictably uninterested in command structure, keeps walking through cordons and occasionally helps a firefighter roll a hose or steadies a television crew whose camera tripod has sunk into soft asphalt, and his indifference becomes the hardest variable for the military to accept. When a Washington liaison suggests a demonstration of force, a low-yield ordnance aimed to test threshold effects, Superman objects on principle, arguing that the city and its people are already the test bed and that casualties will only complicate an answer they do not have. General Lane replies with the old military calculus. When the unknown could be weaponized, hesitation is the luxury of those with secure borders, and he signs the authorization for a tactical strike under the tightest constraints. The first live test is planned above a vacant lot where emergency services have cleared bystanders, and where WayneTech has deployed airbags and deflection barriers, and the whole exercise looks clinical as long as the cameras are rolling. A missile with a modified charge, designed to deliver a concussive pulse rather than fragmentation, is guided through the sky, and Superman watches it with a hand half raised in case the blast radius expands unpredictably. Saitama strolls into the lot mere moments before impact, pausing to pick up an empty soda can and flip it idly in his fingers, and the image of a man fiddling with trash as a weapon hurtles toward him is the kind of contradiction that sends military planners into corners of procedural panic. When the missile detonates, the concussive pulse should have created a radial shock audible even from a distance, and instead the wavefront collapses on itself, as if the air has been asked to stop carrying force. The sensors read an abrupt drop in expected overpressure at distances that should have registered maximum effect, and the lot's test rigs remain intact save for the soda can that rolls harmlessly away from Saitama's foot. The project leads scramble to reconcile telemetrics with footage that shows a normal human face blink at a bright light, and then pocket the can as if nothing extraordinary occurred. And the scramble becomes a scramble of a different sort when the after-action feed shows a spiderweb of micro-deformations in nearby concrete that do not match the blast pattern. Lois Lane broadcasts the footage live with a voice that carries more urgency than the network expected, and her question into the camera, "Who is he if a missile can't touch him?" begins to shape public perception faster than the military's briefings. The next escalation is political as much as tactical. Senators demand hearings. The president requests options that do not involve mass casualties. And Amanda Waller, when briefed, recommends a contingency that is brutal and surgical with measures she calls necessary for national security. Her counsel is the kind that opens doors to black programs and off-the-books operations, and it forces Superman to confront a grim institutional willingness to cross lines in order to define and control what cannot be defined. Cause becomes effect when an unsanctioned unit, working from Waller's recommendation and funded through a shell allocation, deploys a prototype device in the dead of night outside the city. A concentrated electromagnetic cage engineered to disrupt matter at a scale no public paper describes. They transport the device under cover and set it to pulse at intensities calculated to force a response if the phenomenon depends on conventional interactions of force and mass. WayneTech intelligence flags the transport. Batman intercepts fragments of comms that hint at the intention, and Superman races to the site hopping to prevent anything that could harm civilians, while Saitama, who had been shopping for a new pair of slippers, happens upon the operation simply because a truck blocked his path. The device activates before anyone can reach a safe shutoff, throwing a field that ripples like heat above the ground and that should, by every model in the room, distort tissue or at least interfere with instrumentation. Cameras in the surrounding trees see the field touch Saitama and then blink out as if reality hiccuped, and the device's operators watch screens go dark where their diagnostics should live. For the first time, a weapon designed specifically to force a measurable reaction fails not by shrapnel or a miss, but by refusing to register the contact it was built to provoke, which is the kind of failure that compels classified files to be rewritten. The irreversible escalation is not immediate carnage, but a strategic choice. Waller advises seizing him by any means necessary. Lane authorizes a cordon and rules of engagement expand, and political actors begin to whisper about extradition to a facility where oversight will be minimal and control maximal. Superman finds himself arguing against a timeline that prefers containment to understanding, and Batman finesses a legal maneuver to stall a formal transfer. Saitama, who has caused none of this by intent, and who remains almost comically uninterested in both the weapon and the debate that follows, scratches his head and asks whether anyone sells instant ramen in secure facilities, which only intensifies the human drama around a man who cannot be measured and whom institutions want to lock. As night falls, military columns reposition around the city, and an experimental containment cell that neither science nor law can endorse is loaded into an armored convoy, the route chosen for speed rather than transparency. Superman hovers above with Lucius on comms trying to devise non-lethal countermeasures. Batman prowls on the rooftops intercepting chatter, and Saitama, oblivious to the logistics that orbit him, pats a stray dog on the head as the convoy rumbles past. The final image that closes the sequence is the convoy's rear doors thudding shut on equipment intended to do what the missile could not: force a reaction and create an answer, and the city collectively holds its breath because the next move will be made by men with orders rather than by a man with no agenda. The footage from the Pentagon's failed containment test circulates faster than any brief could be written, and within hours, the incident migrates from classified channels into every newsroom and government situation room with the force of a contagion. Embassies call one another with the same question. If a missile cannot touch a man and sensors refuse to log the transfer of force, then what have we been building our arsenals to measure? The United Nations convenes an emergency session where ambassadors trade suspicion like currency, and the language shifts from curiosity to precaution. Satellite feeds and open-source clips stitch together a map of anomalies that now cross time zones, and the simple fact that Saitama was filmed walking through 3 separate cities without bodily injury forces states to treat him as more than a domestic anomaly. Within the superpowered community, the reaction is quieter and more immediate, because those who have long navigated the fragile interface between heroes and nations can see how quickly protocol hardens into policy. Wonder Woman joins a secure channel with Superman and Batman, her voice steady as she frames the problem in terms that bridge law and ethics, arguing that containment without comprehension will create monsters out of fear. Barry Allen, moving faster than diplomatic timetables, scrambles to run time-stamped correlations across global events, and he reports back that pockets of structural cancellation have appeared along transit routes wherever Saitama was seen helping civilians. Jaons listens with something like clinical detachment and reports a cognitive anomaly in how witnesses remember the events. Details that should be fixed by trauma are oddly sparse or inconsistent, and that gap in memory becomes as troubling as the physical impossibility itself. State actors do not wait for consensus. Russia and China both activate protocols that have sat in classified folders precisely for situations that refuse easy classification, and the two nations dispatch specialized teams designed to operate in gray zones between diplomacy and force. Their instruments are different from American tech. Some emphasize electromagnetic harmonics, others prefer directed mass drivers scaled down for a test bed. But when each tries its own variant of provocation, the result is the same. Instrument readouts fail to converge, and footage shows measures that should have created effects instead folding back harmlessly around Saitama's presence. That lack of measurable record is worse than failure to militaries, because it implies an inability to learn. If a phenomenon cannot be measured, it cannot be anticipated. The political escalation is volcanic in pace. The Security Council's emergency communique calls for a joint task force under UN oversight to prevent unilateral actions that could provoke escalation. But the very idea of joint custody inflames domestic politics, because containment becomes an act of sovereignty as much as safety. Amanda Waller uses back channels to pressure allied intelligence services into sharing data and quietly advocates for a preemptive extraction plan that she dresses with legal waivers and emergency clauses, arguing that leaving such an unpredictable variable in public space is national suicide. Opponents argue that any capture attempt will be read as an act of aggression and could spark conflict. Superman, standing between policy and personhood, finds his role recast as an interlocutor between global powers and a man who wants nothing more than to buy instant noodles. The military calculus shifts to speed and distributed containment after a meeting where General Lane, flanked by coalition partners, lays out a plan that is surgical by design. Multiple teams will converge on Saitama's location simultaneously, each with non-lethal but coercive technologies designed to deny movement and force an immobilization that can be analyzed. The idea is to avoid a single point of failure and to trace any anomalous dissipation across different tech stacks at once, creating a comparative record that might reveal a pattern. Superman protests that moving Saitama under duress will only amplify mistrust and warns that deploying offensive tech in a populated area turns people into collateral. Wonder Woman counters that allowing the situation to remain uncontrolled is another kind of offense against those who could be harmed by the mystery, and the debate splits the room without a neat resolution. Saitama, who has been photographed in grocery stores, on subway platforms, and standing barefoot on a cobblestone street, remains an absurdly quotidian element amid geopolitical tension. He eats a sandwich in a public park while classified teams map his coordinates and military's posture on borders. He is not furtive. He does not hide. Instead, he wanders through the city helping where he sees need, returning lost children to parents, steadying scaffolding, and politely declining offers of medical scans because, as he says, need the vitamins. Each act of benign help seems to seed another anomaly elsewhere, and every time his path intersects with civilian infrastructure, telemetry reports a cancellation ripple that puzzles engineers and alarms generals. The irreversible escalation is the decision by several nations to move from observation to custody without public consensus, coordinating a transfer under the cloak of an international humanitarian operation, so that political deniability can protect the actors who will act first. A multinational convoy, its composition veiled but its purpose clear, is assembled under a UN cover story to transport Saitama to a secure facility for analysis. Batman, operating in the margins, intercepts parts of the routing plan and routes them through channels that buy a narrow window of time. But Waller has already maneuvered legal permissions that are difficult to unwind. Superman is asked to oversee the transfer as a neutral guardian, an ironic request because neutrality ordinarily belongs to institutions and not to individuals whose presence affects outcomes. Public opinion fractures between outrage and fear. Some see Saitama as a savior who stopped collapses and a target who undermines sovereignty. Others view him as a weapon in the wild that must be contained before someone with less restraint finds him. Protesters gather outside the designated transit hub, and counter-protesters line up in support of decisive action, creating the optics of a city teetering between civil liberty and enforced security. Lois Lanes reports thread through the tension, asking blunt questions into cameras that do not want the answers, while satellite feeds show armored transports threaded through urban arteries. Amid that human noise, Saitama boards the convoy with the same casual patience he brings to a grocery queue, waving at a dog and offering to hold the door for an EMT who asks to come along. As engines start and the convoy begins to move, Coalition Command activates a containment grid, not a single device, but an array of fields calibrated in sequence to create overlapping zones, intended to deny exit or entry without physical harm. The systems hum to life one by one, and the first nodes report normal operation, while the outer monitors begin to rebalance their baselines in anticipation of what they expect to measure. Superman, hovering above to provide oversight and to act if anything goes wrong, watches the telemetry scroll and feels that old, particular unsettlement. They are configuring doctrine around a man who refuses to be read. The international response has locked itself into motion, and the convoy carrying a man who treats the world like a place to walk through is already on its way to somewhere designed to make him a problem that can be contained. The convoy leaves the city limits under a legal fiction that calls the operation humanitarian transport, but the physical reality is a moving lattice of overlapping containment fields calibrated to restrict movement without contact. Each vehicle carries a node tuned to a different interaction model: electromagnetic, gravitational, inertial, because coalition engineers have agreed that redundancy is the only defense against a phenomenon that has not yet admitted a measurable edge. Superman remains overhead as a neutral observer, feeding passive scans into a shared channel that now includes Wonder Woman, Batman, and a rotating panel of scientists who are attempting to correlate the hum of machinery with the steady, unremarkable rhythm of Saitama's heartbeat. Inside the lead transport, Saitama sits on a bench and watches the scenery pass through reinforced glass, asking an attendant whether the facility has hot water because he forgot to eat before leaving. The attendant, a medic seconded from a UN disaster unit, nods without understanding why the question matters, and the ordinariness of the exchange becomes the first point of resistance in a system designed for compliance under pressure. As the convoy enters the first containment zone, instruments report the expected rise in field strength, and the nodes begin their sequential pulse, creating a layered denial that should feel like wading through deep water. It does not. The internal cameras show Saitama adjusting his posture to make room for a duffel bag, and the field monitors report a dip in local intensity around his seat that should not occur without an equipment fault. Batman flags the anomaly and requests a synchronized recalibration, because if the array is bleeding strength along a moving contour, they will need to identify whether the contour follows Saitama or the vehicle. Lucius Fox routes a diagnostic that compares the node outputs to WayneTech's earlier drone data, and the match that returns is the same cancellation ripple observed whenever Saitama steadied a beam or a barrier. Cause becomes effect when the convoy reaches a narrow causeway and a maintenance gantry above begins to settle without warning, the steel bowing in a way that suggests a localized compressive event has preceded them. Traffic control has already cleared the lane, but a service crew remains on the platform, and Superman moves to intercept the sag before it cascades onto the road. Saitama stands as the transport slows, places his hand against the interior wall as if to steady himself, and the gantry's stress map flattens on Fox's feed in the same instant. Coalition Command interprets the correlation as a breach of the array's intent, and a secondary protocol activates to increase field density around the lead vehicle while maintaining distance from civilian structures. The array's hum deepens into a tone that rattles glassware in trailing vans, and the medic beside Saitama glances at a monitor that shows a waveform deviating from its baseline. Superman listens for strain in Saitama's breathing or a change in pulse, and hears neither, and the lack of physiological response becomes the axis around which the entire operation begins to tilt. A named reaction cuts through the channel when Wonder Woman asks whether the system is attempting to deny motion by creating a gradient rather than a barrier, and the engineers confirm that the intent is to make every step feel heavier than the last. Batman counters that if Saitama is not stepping against the gradient in any measurable sense, then the gradient has nothing to act upon, which would explain why the field's intensity dips along a moving perimeter without registering transfer. The realization spreads with the speed of shared screens. They are attempting to resist a presence that does not seem to participate in the interactions their tools manipulate. Irreversible escalation arrives when a trailing vehicle reports a cascading failure in its node after a routine pulse. The system's safety interlocks tripping as internal components register feedback that should only occur under overload. The convoy halts to prevent a chain reaction, and Coalition Command authorizes a localized increase around Saitama's compartment to maintain integrity while technicians reset the failing unit. Cameras show him scratching his cheek and asking whether the stop is for a bathroom break, and the medic, unsure how to respond, points to a portable unit bolted to the floor. Outside, Superman coordinates with ground teams to secure the causeway while Fox monitors the array for further dips, and the pattern that emerges is consistent enough to frighten planners who prefer randomness to rules they cannot test. Every time Saitama shifts his weight or places a hand against a surface, the nearest node reports a temporary flattening of its intended gradient, as if the field has been persuaded to forget how to press. Batman requests permission to decouple one node for a controlled observation, but Lane denies it on the grounds that integrity must be maintained until the facility is reached. Public feeds begin to pick up rumors of a stoppage, and Lois Lane, tracking the convoy from a parallel route, reports that emergency vehicles are diverting traffic miles ahead. The political cost of a visible failure grows by the minute, and Waller's office quietly recommends moving to a more assertive denial once they are clear of populated areas. Superman hears the recommendation and understands what it implies: a willingness to trade principle for data. As technicians finish resetting the trailing node and the convoy prepares to move again, a new alert arrives from the facility itself: a power fluctuation along the outer containment ring that was meant to receive them. The arrival point is already compromised, and the plan to move the unknown into a place designed to measure him is now intersecting with an infrastructure that may not hold. The convoy accelerates despite the warning, and the resistance array hums louder as dominance, indifferent and unasked for, travels within its center. The facility was designed for objects that push back, for entities that resist with measurable force or energy, and its outer ring hums with the confidence of systems calibrated against known physics as the convoy approaches under escort. Layers of containment interlock in sequence: magnetic baffles, inertial dampers, harmonic disruptors, each one meant to create a gradient that denies motion without tearing tissue or crushing bone. Superman descends alongside the lead transport as gates part and reseal behind them, while technicians inside a glassed-in control room watch the incoming telemetry with the brittle hope that proximity will finally produce a pattern they can read. Saitama steps out when the rear doors open and looks around with mild curiosity, asking an attendant whether there's a vending machine because the trip took longer than expected. The first ring engages as he crosses the threshold, and the floor sensors report a clean activation that should create the subtle drag of increased effective mass. Instead, the drag maps itself around him, a shallow bowl in the gradient that moves with his stride and leaves the rest of the field intact, which forces a supervisor to check for calibration drift, even as Batman flags the same cancellation ripple observed in the city. Cause becomes effect when a forklift in a neighboring bay begins to tilt, as its load shifts under a compressive anomaly that should not exist inside an active denial field, and Superman moves to stabilize it while calling for a halt to secondary pulses. Saitama places a hand on the forklift's frame to help a worker step clear, and the bay's stress map flattens across 3 separate sensors that were not meant to agree with one another. The control room registers the flattening as a localized failure and escalates to the second ring to maintain integrity around the intake corridor. Wonder Woman watches the readouts from a remote station and asks whether the rings are attempting to act upon a contact interface that may not be there, and the lead engineer admits that every model assumes participation in the field's interactions. Lucius Fox routes a comparative analysis from WayneTech's earlier drone passes and the facility's live data, and the match returns with unsettling clarity. Wherever Saitama steadies a structure or touches a surface, the intended pressure of the system forgets itself. Superman listens for a change in breath or pulse as the second ring deepens the gradient and hears none. Irreversible escalation arrives when the harmonic disruptors activate to deny coherent motion by introducing oscillations across multiple frequencies, a measure reserved for entities that phase or accelerate unpredictably. The oscillation should create nausea or at least force a compensatory stance, but Saitama simply pauses to read a sign about safety protocols, his cape lifting slightly in a draft that the airflow monitors insist is not present. Cameras capture the disruptor's waveform dipping around his outline, as though the interference has encountered a contour it cannot climb. A named reaction cuts into the channel when General Lane authorizes a third-ring engagement against protocol, arguing that the intake must be secured before any further movement risks facility-wide compromise. Batman counters that stacking gradients on a system already experiencing localized cancellation could propagate a larger failure. But the order stands, and the inertial dampers spin up with a tone that vibrates through the control room's glass. Superman positions himself between Saitama and a cluster of technicians, prepared to intercept any physical hazard, even as the instruments insist there is nothing to intercept. The dampers reach operational threshold, and the corridor lights flicker as power is redistributed to maintain field integrity, and the first indicator of systemic strain appears as a temperature drop along a cable bank that should be warming under load. Saitama shifts his weight to let a guard pass, and 3 independent monitors log a simultaneous flattening of the gradient at distances that do not share a node. The lead engineer begins a shutdown sequence for the second ring, but the command returns a delay as safety interlocks attempt to prevent a cascade. Outside the intake, Lois Lane reports on the facility's sealed perimeter while helicopters circle at a mandated distance, and public speculation spikes as unofficial feeds show lights dimming in synchronized bands. Waller's office requests confirmation that the third ring is active and recommends maintaining pressure until a measurable response is recorded, a suggestion that turns the operation from intake to experiment without anyone saying the word. Wonder Woman asks Superman to withdraw Saitama from the corridor before the system escalates further. But the exit path is already under a gradient that deepens without leaving a trace on Saitama's step. The containment grid begins to behave like a structure under load, not by cracking but by redistributing its intent, and that redistribution follows the same moving perimeter that has haunted every prior attempt to measure him. A power fluctuation ripples through the outer ring, and a breaker trips in a bay that does not share circuitry with the intake, and the control room realizes that the failure is no longer local. The plan to move the unknown into a place designed to measure him has inverted, and the place is now being measured by a presence that refuses to be acted upon. As alarms escalate from advisory to warning, the facility's master control cues an emergency venting of field density to prevent equipment damage, but the command stalls behind interlocks that read conflicting states. Superman hears the steady heartbeat beside him and understands that the next change will not be a number on a screen, but a loss of control they cannot localize. The third ring hums louder as technicians reach for manual overrides, and the containment breakdown has already begun in motion. The moment the third ring fails to vent on command, the facility stops behaving like a laboratory and starts acting like a sealed pressure vessel that has forgotten how to release strain, because every safeguard designed to prevent cascading overload now reads conflicting inputs that cannot be reconciled. Power reroutes along emergency conduits, inertial dampers spool without reference to the intake corridor, and the harmonic disruptors continue to oscillate as if they have been decoupled from the very system that should govern them. Superman moves Saitama toward the nearest manual override to create space for technicians, but the floor sensors beneath their feet report a uniform gradient that should make motion difficult for anyone with mass. Saitama does not appear to notice. He pauses to let a scientist pass with an armful of diagnostic tablets and asks whether the vending machine is on another level, which becomes an absurd counterpoint to the way the corridor lights begin to strobe under load shedding. Batman's voice tightens on the channel as he requests an immediate shutdown of all active rings, arguing that continued oscillation risks turning the intake into a resonant cavity. The lead engineer confirms that the shutdown command has been issued twice, and that interlocks are refusing to disengage, because multiple nodes report that their gradients are already below operational threshold. Cause becomes effect when the facility's outer containment ring attempts to compensate for the intake's instability by increasing density across the perimeter, an automated decision meant to prevent a breach that now propagates strain along corridors that were never designed to host it. A storage bay 2 levels down reports shelving compressing without contact, and Superman drops through the floor to stabilize a rack that begins to fold in on itself. Back in the intake, Saitama places a hand against the wall to steady himself as an alarm panel comes loose, and 3 separate monitors register a flattening of the gradient in areas that do not share a power bus. Wonder Woman orders an evacuation of non-essential personnel and requests that Saitama be escorted out of the active zone, but the path to the exit is now under a deepening field that hums with a pitch low enough to vibrate bone. Superman returns to find that the harmonic disruptors have shifted frequency in response to the compensation attempt, and the new oscillation begins to couple with the dampers in a way that produces a standing wave along the corridor. Instruments should be screaming with data. Instead, they display voids where readings cannot be established, as though the interference has encountered a moving absence. Irreversible escalation arrives when the facility's core stabilization system, designed to prevent sympathetic vibrations from propagating through the structure, initiates a lock that seals bulkheads across multiple levels. The lock was meant to buy time during catastrophic events, but it now traps teams inside a gradient that deepens in pockets without pattern, and the air handling system reports pressure differentials that do not match any open or closed state. Superman attempts to force a bulkhead to create an alternate route and feels resistance that does not translate into measurable force, as if the door has been asked to be heavier rather than held shut. A named reaction cuts in when Barry Allen arrives at the perimeter and offers to phase teams out in small groups, but the standing wave in the intake corridor interferes with his entry vector, forcing him to withdraw before he can risk becoming trapped himself. Jayons reports that the cognitive anomalies among witnesses are increasing, with evacuees unable to describe the layout of rooms they exited seconds ago, and the possibility that the field is interacting with perception, as well as matter, becomes a new and unwelcome variable. Batman orders all teams to fall back to stairwells that remain outside the densest gradients, but the path to those stairwells shifts on the monitors as cancellation ripples move. Saitama steps toward a sagging ceiling panel to prevent it from dropping on a pair of technicians, and the panel steadies without transferring load to the struts above, which should be impossible in a system already under compensation. The lead engineer watches the live map update to show a temporary normalization across 3 adjacent corridors, and realizes that the facility is now taking its cues from a presence it was meant to constrain. Waller's office, patched into the command net, advises maintaining the third ring to force a measurable response, and Wonder Woman responds that they are now measuring the failure of their own assumptions. Outside, Lois Lane reports that the perimeter lights have dimmed in concentric bands, and that emergency crews are being asked to retreat beyond the outer fence, and the visual of a state-of-the-art containment site losing coherence becomes a public crisis within minutes. General Lane authorizes a last-resort stabilization that floods the intake with a counter-gradient intended to cancel the standing wave, a measure that will risk structural integrity if it couples incorrectly. Superman positions himself between Saitama and the nearest cluster of personnel, prepared to shield them from falling debris even as he knows debris is no longer the primary hazard. The countergradient engages with a tone that feels less like sound and more like pressure against the inside of the skull, and for a heartbeat the monitors show a convergence that suggests the system might settle. Then the convergence inverts around Saitama's outline, the gradient flattening in a shape that does not correspond to any node or cable run, and the standing wave shifts its crest down the corridor toward the core. The facility is now the site of a conflict that resembles physics arguing with itself, and the outcome will not be confined to the intake level. When the countergradient inverts, the facility's core stabilization does not fail all at once. It forgets its hierarchy and layers, because subsystems that were meant to defer to master control begin to act on local readings that no longer correspond to shared reality. Bulkheads that sealed to buy time now seal to trap gradients. Ventilation dampers choke corridors that need pressure equalization, and the power grid begins to route current away from lights and into dampers that have nothing left to act upon. Superman can feel the structure behaving like a lung that cannot decide whether to inhale or exhale, and every attempt to relieve strain in one corridor shifts it into another that has already been evacuated. Saitama steadies a railing to let a technician pass and asks if there's a staircase to the vending machines, and the map in Lucius Fox's feed flattens for 3 seconds across a level that had reported critical compression. That temporary normalization saves a pair of engineers attempting to reach an override, but it also triggers a cascade in a storage wing where shelving begins to compress without transferring load to the floor. Batman orders a full retreat to the outer stairwells, his voice cutting through overlapping channels as teams scramble to move in a building that is changing its relationship to weight. Cause becomes effect when the outer ring, interpreting the intake's normalization as a breach, increases density along the perimeter to prevent an exit that command never authorized. The automated decision creates a pressure differential between interior corridors and the sealed exterior that the air handling system cannot reconcile, and doors that should open under emergency protocols remain shut without any measurable force holding them. Superman forces one such door and hears nothing but the steady, unhurried heartbeat behind him as Saitama steps through and holds it for a medic with a sprained ankle. Irreversible escalation arrives when the core stabilization initiates a structural lock designed for seismic events, a measure that anchors key supports in place to prevent sympathetic vibration from propagating through the frame. The lock engages across a lattice that includes the intake, the storage wing, and the power routing hub, and the result is a building that cannot shift strain even as the gradients move. A beam in the storage wing dims under compression and then disappears into itself in a way that leaves a void where support once existed, and the ceiling above begins to settle with no fracture to warn of the drop. Wonder Woman calls for immediate evacuation of all levels and requests that Saitama be escorted outside before further locks engage, but the path to the exterior now reports a uniform gradient that deepens without leaving a trace on Saitama's step. Superman moves ahead to clear debris that is not quite debris yet, and the floor beneath his boots registers resistance that does not translate into pressure. Behind him, Saitama places a hand against a sagging conduit to let a group of technicians pass, and the conduit steadies long enough for them to reach a stairwell. A named reaction fractures the plan when Barry Allen attempts a second entry to phase trap teams out, only to find his vector disrupted by a standing wave that has migrated toward the core stabilization hub. He withdraws with a warning that the interference is no longer confined to the intake corridor, and Jayons reports that evacuees outside are struggling to recall which exits they used, as if the building has become difficult to remember. Batman reroutes teams toward a maintenance ramp that should bypass the locked lattice, but the ramp's support columns begin to dimple as the structural lock denies them the ability to redistribute load. The loss is not announced. It happens in a series of quiet adjustments as a section of the storage wing settles a meter without cracking, and the ceiling meets shelving that can no longer move. Superman reaches the edge of the collapse and braces a panel that was never meant to carry weight, buying seconds for a final pair of engineers to clear the threshold. Saitama stands beside him, looking mildly concerned for the first time as a light fixture swings free, and he steadies it so it won't strike anyone on the stairs. Outside, Lois Lane's report shifts from speculation to confirmation as emergency crews pull back beyond the outer fence, and a section of the facility's roofline drops without dust, the void beneath swallowing the sound that should accompany failure. General Lane authorizes a full shutdown of the rings to prevent further coupling, but the command stalls behind interlocks that still believe gradients are within tolerance. The containment site was meant to create an answer. It has instead created a loss that cannot be reversed by reopening doors. As the last evacuees reach the perimeter, a tremor passes through the ground that does not register on seismic monitors, and the power routing hub reports a final redistribution that leaves the intake in darkness. Superman listens for heartbeats and hears too few where there should be more, and the understanding settles that the building has taken people with it in a way that left no fracture to trace. The conflict has moved beyond containment into consequence, and the next response will not be measured in gradients, but in what the world decides to do with a loss it cannot explain. In the hours after the collapse, the site does not burn or flood or fracture along lines that engineers can map. It settles into a geometry that refuses to keep its promises, because corridors that were evacuated remain open while others that were cleared fold into shallow bowls with no debris to mark the change. Search teams establish a perimeter that expands by necessity rather than design, and drones sent to probe the void return footage that cannot be stitched into a consistent floor plan. Superman moves through the dim corridors with rescue crews at his back, listening for the rhythms of life that might still be trapped beneath a system that has chosen to hold without touching. Saitama walks beside a firefighter and steadies a railing that wavers as if under a heavy hand, and for a few seconds the map in Lucius Fox's feed normalizes across a wing that had reported total loss. That normalization allows a pocket of responders to reach a stairwell they had thought sealed, and 3 survivors emerge with no memory of how they moved through the space between floors. Jayons reports that the evacuees' accounts diverge in ways that suggest perception itself has been nudged, with rooms remembered larger or smaller than they were and distances collapsing into single steps. Cause becomes effect when the outer ring, still locked by interlocks that believe gradients remain within tolerance, attempts to reassert integrity across the perimeter and inadvertently deepens the uniform field around the central hub. The hub's supports do not crack. They compress in a sequence that travels like a shadow along beams that cannot pass their strain onward, and the absence of redistribution becomes the new hazard. Wonder Woman orders all teams to fall back from the core, while Superman holds a sagging panel long enough for a medic to guide 2 injured technicians through a service door. Batman requests that Saitama be moved beyond the perimeter to test whether distance alters the field's behavior, because every prior normalization has followed his contact with a surface. Superman relays the request with care, explaining that their models need a control even as he knows there may be no control to establish. Saitama agrees without argument and steps outside the fence, pausing only to ask if anyone has seen his grocery bag. The irreversible escalation arrives within minutes. With Saitama beyond the perimeter, the monitors do not spike as planners hoped. Instead, the gradients in the central hub deepen in a way that removes the brief windows of normalization that had allowed teams to move. A ceiling panel that had hovered in uncertain balance settles the last few centimeters and meets a console bank that cannot shift, and the resulting void takes a support column with it without dust or sound. Superman hears the final, absent heartbeat where a technician had been moments before, and understands that the loss is now expanding in a way no hand can steady. Named voices collide on the channel as General Lane orders a full abandonment of the inner levels, and Waller recommends sealing the site with a permanent exclusion zone, her language already preparing the public for a sacrifice made in the name of safety. Lois Lane broadcasts from the perimeter with a voice that carries the weight of a story that has moved beyond explanation, and she asks whether the presence that saved so many is also the condition that prevents the rest from being reached. Wonder Woman counters that correlation is not culpability, but the question has already taken root. Superman returns to the fence and looks out to where Saitama stands beside an ambulance, offering a bottle of water to a shaken responder, and the simple act becomes a moral fault line. If bringing him back inside creates windows that save lives, they must choose to do so knowing the system will also respond in ways that cannot be predicted. If they keep him out, they accept that normalization will not occur and that pockets will close without warning. The decision is made in motion. Superman steps aside to let Saitama re-enter, and as Saitama places a hand against the outer wall to steady a stretcher, the map inside Fox's feed flattens across 2 corridors that had been lost. Teams surge through the openings, pulling one more survivor from a stairwell that had become a bowl, even as another wing reports a new compression that denies access elsewhere. The consequence is now God-level, not in spectacle but in arithmetic. Every normalization trades one uncertainty for another, and there is no path that saves all. As the sun sets beyond the perimeter, the facility's silhouette changes without fracture, and a section of the core settles into a shape that cannot be reversed by cutting power or opening doors. The world watches a rescue that must choose where to apply presence, and the next choice will determine how much of the site remains reachable at all. By morning, the facility is no longer a building in any sense the word used to carry, because the parts that remain accessible do so at the expense of others that have settled into geometries rescue crews cannot map without watching them change. The perimeter has been pushed back to a line that responders refuse to cross without a normalization window, and the public briefing has abandoned the language of containment in favor of exclusion. Superman moves between triage tents and the fence line, listening for rhythms that might still be coaxed into reach, while the command net argues over whether any further entries can be justified. Saitama stands near the gate with a paper cup of tea someone pressed into his hand, asking a nurse whether the vending machines inside took coins or cards, and the question lands with a weight no one can explain. When he steps forward to steady a stretcher being wheeled across uneven pavement, Fox's feed shows the outer corridor flatten for 5 seconds, enough for a team to retrieve a final cache of medical kits left in a bay that had been unreachable since midnight. The same contact deepens a gradient near the core, and a section of the roofline settles another inch without dust. Cause becomes effect as command authorizes one last, tightly bounded entry using Saitama as a moving normalization point, not as a tool, but as a condition under which movement becomes possible at all. Wonder Woman frames the decision as triage at a planetary scale, because every window opened here will be paid for somewhere else in the structure, and there is no model that can predict where the payment will fall. Batman routes teams through the 2 corridors that briefly agree to hold their shape, while Superman positions himself at the hinge between what can still be reached and what has already been denied. Irreversible escalation arrives when the core stabilization, deprived of any capacity to redistribute strain, commits the last of its authority to anchoring the central hub in place, an act meant to prevent a catastrophic collapse that instead freezes the interior into a new equilibrium. As Saitama places a hand against a bowed panel to let a medic pass, the hub's remaining supports settle into a configuration that closes 3 levels to future entry without fracture or warning. The survivors brought out in that window will live because of it, and those who were beyond will not be reached because the path has chosen to become heavier than movement itself. Named voices struggle to give shape to the outcome. General Lane orders the site sealed with a permanent exclusion zone that will outlast administrations, and Waller drafts language that describes the loss as an unavoidable cost in the face of an unprecedented hazard. Lois Lane reports that the rescue has ended not with a blast, but with a decision to stop trying, and her camera captures Saitama stepping back from the fence with an apologetic nod to a responder he cannot help further. Superman's X-ray vision sweeps the silhouette that used to be a facility and returns the same inconsistent density it found the first night, an anatomy of concrete that refuses to present the same profile twice. His superhearing finds a handful of steady pulses in the tents behind him, and none in the hub that has chosen its final shape. Heat vision would change nothing. Force would only shift a loss they cannot relocate without paying elsewhere. The world does not return to normal. Engineers begin to study the perimeter as a permanent feature, a place where load and memory behave differently, and nations draft protocols for encountering a presence that cannot be measured without consequence. Saitama asks whether there's a bus that goes downtown, because he left his slippers at the lab, and Superman realizes that the investigation will not end with a classification, but with a boundary drawn around what cannot be understood. The exclusion zone becomes a landmark on maps within weeks, its geometry stable enough to navigate and unstable enough to remember, and every future rescue brief will include a clause that did not exist before. Power that does not participate in the world's interactions has been acknowledged, not defeated, and the moral arithmetic of using it has been written into law. The decisive outcome is not a victory but a rule. When Saitama is present, the world holds differently, and sometimes it holds in ways that cannot be undone.